Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Israeli authorities mull extending nationwide lockdowns as coronavirus infections continue to defy the state's best efforts. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Netanyahu unveils plans to combat the growing rates of violence within Israeli Arab communities. And finally, the Palestinian Authority actually pushes forwards with plans to hold elections in May and in July. All right, to begin, Israeli fighter jets struck multiple Hamas military targets Monday morning in response to the latest rocket fire from Gaza, launched towards Israeli civilian communities. 2 Hamas rockets were reportedly fired towards Ashdod from the Palestinian enclave late on Sunday night. Israeli retaliations, on the other hand, apparently targeting underground terror tunnel dig sites, among other Hamas infrastructure. And as per usual, retaliations targeting Hamas come as Israel holds Hamas responsible for all attacks emanating from the Strip. This as Hamas is the de facto administration in the region, though the IDF is currently investigating whether or not Hamas is actually to blame for the recent launches, as opposed to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or some other local terror group. Now, from one security challenge to another, Israeli authorities are getting ever closer to extending lockdown measures as the coronavirus infection rates in the country continue ballooning to record rates. Over 2 million Israelis vaccinated against coronavirus and quickly rising. This is the prevailing headline for positive news in the region, and for good reason, as the light at the end of the pandemic tunnel gets brighter and brighter with every inoculation. The Israeli Prison Service is even now announcing that it'll finally begin vaccinating all of its inmates this week, including Palestinian security prisoners. But of course, this is only part of the tragically ongoing story. With a staggering 9.1% positivity rate, Israel's number of active coronavirus cases has now risen overnight to at least 80,600. Over 1,200 cases in severe condition, and the death toll now breaking 4,000. The dramatically rising numbers then, in turn, leading to a rise in deaths from comorbidities, or often simply to lack of resources. Research from the Weizmann Institute and Hebrew University claiming that nearly 1 in every 3 COVID-related deaths this month was traced back to hospital overcrowding and could have been avoided. So with the alarmingly high infection rates in mind, Israeli officials are now hinting at an extension to the current nationwide lockdowns, including ordering Israelis recently returning from South Africa, Zambia, Brazil, and the UAE to enter coronavirus hotels, ordering all Israelis returning from any other country to quarantine in hotels or at home after getting a coronavirus test, and suggesting that Ben Gurion Airport in its entirety be shut down for a short time. In other news, with the rapid growth of participation in Israel's COVID vaccination campaign, so too have the calls for more transparency grown regarding medical data that Israel promised to share with Pfizer and BioNTech. And this in return for preference in getting vaccine deliveries to Israel in the first place. Well, answering the call, Israeli authorities have finally published some of the details of the deal, now known as the Real-World Epidemiological Evidence Collaboration Agreement. And according to what we know from this deal, Israel will provide Pfizer with epidemiological data to allow the pharma company to more swiftly evaluate the efficacy of the vaccine, data that is largely assumed to include the total number of COVID-19 cases, the number of people hospitalized and in serious or ventilated condition, the number of fatalities and people with symptoms, the number of people vaccinated according to age and other population segments, and finally, also the number of people testing positive for the virus according to population segments. Also, Israel and Pfizer have agreed to discuss the data on a weekly basis, where they'll decide on how to proceed. The agreement does not, however, provide Pfizer with any data that is not necessary for improving public health or that can in any way allow for discrimination. And Pfizer is also barred from exposing any individual patient information, neither personally nor through a third party. Still, all that said, and in spite of the recent release, there are many leftover questions and even several sections either left blank or still completely blacked out in the release, including the entire liability section, the names of some of the signatories, and the original signing date for the agreement. And joining us now with more on the Israeli-Pfizer data sharing agreement is Professor Manfred Green, Director of the Masters in Public Health Program at the University of Haifa. Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Now, our data sharing agreement...
Shalom. Hi.
Thank you so much. Now, our data sharing agreement with Pfizer was released in part for the public's viewing. In your expert opinion, what data does Pfizer really need to analyze the vaccine's efficacy?
Okay, basically, what's happening is that the Ministry of Health is collecting data that by law they collect. It's a notifiable disease, so by law they collect that data, and they're collecting data on vaccination. It's obviously very important to the ministry and to others to make sure that we can evaluate the efficacy of the vaccine. So this same data will be used to look at the extent to which we see efficacy of the vaccine in what we would call the post-marketing era, because the vaccine has been approved for use. There's no problem with the vaccine. The sharing with Pfizer is basically to share that same data, and as I understand from the agreement, it will simply be a technical way of actually sharing the data in a more user-friendly manner. But I would add that I would assume that that kind of data will be made available to the public, or at least to investigators in the public, to use at the same time. So that would be the only thing that I would see as something that should be made
so
clear.
let's get to the heart of most Israelis' concerns. Is any of the data that Israel will be providing Pfizer, would you consider any of that data unethical to provide them or unnecessary to provide them?
Not at all. It's anonymous data. We use it all the time. I'm not even adding the fact that we're under emergency conditions, but without those emergency conditions, this is data that is essential for the public health. So if Pfizer is helping with the analysis of that data, that's something that would be very much appreciated. I just think that, and this data, as I said, is data that is actually available usually to investigators outside of the Ministry of Health. It's anonymous data.
So what data would qualify as unethical in your opinion?
It depends really under the circumstances. Basically, the data that would be unethical for not going through, not ethical, but would have to go through a Helsinki or a human use committee, are data that are identifiable or potentially identifiable. And there doesn't seem to be any evidence that that's occurring at the moment.
And then going back to what you said previously, then, again, assuming based on your word that this is publicly available data in the first place and that it is ethical to be sharing, especially given the time, is that a sort of situation where the ends justify the means?
I think that this ministry should make it clear. The only thing that they're doing, and that's very useful, obviously, is they're going to make the data more available in a much more user-friendly way. And that's something that we've been encouraging all the time. So that's why I say it's a good thing that they're doing it with a company, because then it'll be available to other investigators and it'll be available to the ministry. So I think that in fact this is a very good actually objective. That the fact that it has to remain anonymous is obvious. That it must be very clear that there will be no divulgement of any of the personal data.
All right, Professor Manfred Green, thank you so much for sharing your time.
Thanks very much.
Now, moving to more depressing matters, unfortunately, Israeli police and security services are opening a new investigation into an alleged Israeli stone-throwing attack that sent an 11-year-old Palestinian girl to hospital with injuries to her face. The victim's uncle explaining that the young girl was playing alone outside her house when a group of settlers, apparently from the nearby settlement of Yitzchar, came and threw stones towards her and their houses. Rights group like Yesh Din adding that at least 41 settler attacks against Palestinians have reportedly taken place in the last few weeks, particularly in the wake of the death of 16-year-old Ahuvia Sandak, who was killed in a car crash as he and several other suspects were trying to escape from Israeli police custody. But whatever the case, whether from Palestinians or even nationalist Jews, ILTV condemns wholeheartedly any violence of this kind and applauds Israeli police for their efforts to blindly pursue justice. Meanwhile, with another sharp rise in criminal violence in Israeli Arab communities, Prime Minister Netanyahu unveiling a multi-pronged response to bring down the tragic numbers. Hannah Rifkin with the details.
In one opinion poll after the next, Israeli Arabs consistently call out violence within their communities as their highest priority issue. This as 7 Israeli Arabs and a Palestinian have already been killed in homicide since the beginning of 2021. And following 96 more homicides, most of them shootings, reported in 2020. Well, with this in mind, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu unveiling the newest plan to a group of Israeli Arab mayors Sunday night.
אנחנו מתגייסים למשימה לאומית. אני יודע עד כמה אתם והתושבים שלכם, האזרחים הערבים שלנו, סובלים מאלימות, מרציחות, מסחיטה, מהשוק השחור, מקבוצות המאפיה, מפרוטקשן, מנשק בלתי חוקי, ממכרזים עירוניים תחת איום של טרור ואלימות, ועוד דברים רבים שקשה כרגע למצות את כולם.
Now, the three-pronged plan, with details set to come, quote, in the coming days, includes a new economic stimulus plan, an extension of credit to Arab Israelis who've suffered under supposed institutional discrimination from the banks, and a general plan to combat the rise in violence. Netanyahu adding that in a modern country, we can effectively deal with the issue like we deal with terror.
הציבור הערבי רוצה להרגיש בטוח בדיוק כפי שמרגישים כל אזרחי ישראל, והוא צודק בדרישה הזאת. אני אומר לכם, זהו גם צו השעה. אני רואה בפשיעה, באלימות, לא רק איום עליכם, אני רואה בו איום על כולנו. ואני רואה במאבק נגד פשע, האלימות והפשיעה, כחלק מרכזי בביטחון הלאומי של מדינת ישראל.
That said, while 21 mayors and council heads attended the video conference, several Arab mayors called to boycott the meeting. Critics are concerned that this is just more political talk ahead of elections in March, and without any hope of follow-through, especially as Netanyahu has made many similar announcements throughout his tenure, including last week in Nazareth, a few months ago in November at a meeting for the Knesset Committee on Violence and Crime in the Arab sector, in March of 2020 and October of 2019, and many other times before that. Alfa Mayor Samir Sobhi Mahamid, who was in the Zoom meeting for one, telling the Times of Israel that Netanyahu must prove himself, particularly now after telling them that they were right on every point raised in the discussion.
So how bad is criminal violence in Arab-Israeli communities? And does Prime Minister Netanyahu's new plan to beat it back hold any water? Here to discuss, we have attorney and Israeli journalist at Ynet, Ben-Dor Yemini. Ben-Dor, thank you so much for being with us. Now, how bad is the problem?
Yeah, needless to say, the numbers are speaking for themselves. When you see the numbers, you know that we are facing a real problem, which is getting worse actually every year because just from January 1st, we are speaking about 7 people, and it's much more than the monthly average of 2020. So yes, it is a real problem, and we cannot ignore it. We could not ignore it before. Of course, we cannot ignore it now.
Well, so now the Prime Minister has spoken about taking action on this for some time. Has there been any real action taken, or discussions in the works, or does it appear to just be words and empty promises ahead of elections?
First, it should be tested in the long run. Right now, we do not know. I can just tell you one thing. It's not a question of money, because many people always say, we need more budgets. No, it's not the point. It's not the point because last decade, and you don't have to be a supporter of Netanyahu in order to admit it, last decade was the best decade from the point of view of budget to the Israeli Arabs. Did it help? No, it did not help. It helped in other fields, for example, education. For example, we know that the percentage of students in the universities, even in the leading universities, went up, which is great, which is wonderful, but it did not solve the problem of violence. And I'm going to say something which is maybe not politically correct. Yes, we have to think about culture, we have to think about tradition, and we have to face it. And when I say it, I do not mean only Arabs or Muslims, because it's not the point. The point is that we, in the 50s, for example, something of that kind, crimes, honor killings, were also among the new immigrants who came to Israel. And it does not exist anymore. The same happened with Ethiopian Jews. First generations, yes, they had much more honor killings or killings or crimes. And the older generation does not have it at all. Why? Because the change in culture. somehow we have to face the problem also from the cultural point of view.
Also,
it's not that I'm going to give you a solution because I'm not sure that we have a solution. I do know that self-responsibility should be part of the solution. When I'm speaking about self-responsibility, I'm speaking about activists from the community, leaders of the community that must do much more.
all right, Ben Yemeni, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Now, for more, please visit our new and improved website at ILTV.tv and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for daily updates while you're there. In other news, the Palestinian Authority seems more serious about holding its own elections than it has been in a decade and a half. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas hosting Jordanian and Egyptian intelligence chiefs on Sunday to brief them on the plan. In a decree made Friday, Palestinian Authority President and Fatah Party leader Mahmoud Abbas announced plans for holding Palestinian parliamentary elections this coming May and presidential elections in July. And if they go through, these votes would be the first Palestinian elections in 14 years. Or more specifically, the first since 2007, when Abbas's control over the Gaza Strip was violently overthrown by the Hamas terror organization, which had won in the internal elections the year before. So many Palestinians then are expressing cautious optimism, particularly as Fatah and Hamas have yet to return to any sort of unity or official cooperation. In fact, 76% of Palestinians polled said that they believe Fatah would reject the results if Hamas wins, and that 58% believe the same of Hamas in the event of a Fatah victory.
نحن بحاجة لمضبوط حالة ديمقراطية للتغيير الجذري إن كان من وزراء أو إن كان من مجلس وطني له سنين موجود في على كراسي بحاجة لتجديد دم جديد من الشباب لبناء وطن حر ديمقراطي مبني على كامل التراب الفلسطيني.
قرار سليم 100% بدليل انه الاستحقاق له ما لا يقل عن 15 سنة اذا مش اكثر. والمفروض انه احنا كدولة بداية دولة انه يكون عندنا ديمقراطية والديمقراطية هي بالانتخابات.
But Hamas, meanwhile, is welcoming the news amidst multiple election polls, still placing the terror group in a comfortable lead above the competition.
ترحب حركة حماس بصدور المراسيم الرئاسية بشأن الانتخابات العامة، المجلس الوطني والمجلس التشريعي والرئاسية، وهنا تؤكد الحركة حرصها الشديد على إنجاح هذا الاستحقاق بما يحقق مصلحة الشعب الفلسطيني صاحب الحق المطلق في اختيار قيادته وممثليه. عملت حركة حماس طوال الأشهر الماضية على تذليل كل العقبات للوصول إلى هذا اليوم، وأبدينا مرونة عالية إيمانا منا بأن العهدة للشعب ويجب أن تكون في يد الشعب. كما نؤكد بكل قوة على أهمية تهيئة المناخ لانتخابات حرة نزيهة وشفافة يعبر فيها الناخب الفلسطيني عن إرادته دون ضغوط أو قيود وبكل عدالة وشفافية.
Still, that said, would-be Palestinian voters also recognize Israel's role in the region and demand for national security ahead of any coming vote, especially when it comes to the possibility of Hamas building up and using military power in Judea and Samaria, as they have in the Gaza Strip, a reality that no Israeli government would willingly abide.
يعني إسرائيل لها موقف من القدس والإجراء الانتخابات في القدس، وأصلا حتى إجراء الانتخابات بدون أن تحصل على فوائد منها. إسرائيل تريد انتخابات تكرس اتفاق أوسلو وتكرس التزاماته وتكرس سلطة الحكم الذاتي وتروض حماس، ولا انتخابات تقوي الفلسطينيين. هذه مسألة في منتهى الأهمية. أيضا الموقف الأمريكي، هل توافق إدارة بايدن على حكومة تشارك بها حماس أو أي من الفصائل المصنفة ضمن قائمة المنظمات الإرهابية؟ هذا سؤال كبير. أعتقد أن الإجابة عليه حتى الآن هو على الأرجح أنها لن توافق، وإذا وافقت ستكون هناك مفاجأة. هذه نقطة يجب أن يستعد لها الفلسطينيون لكي يتم التعامل معها من الآن ولا يتركوها إلى عندما تنفجر في وجوههم.
But finally, all this speculation is for naught until elections are actually held, and expectations of this happening remain fairly low. Most critics believing instead that this is simply a political ploy to curry favor with the coming Biden administration. Now, politics aside, Israel's landscape is seemingly undergoing some other major changes in the wake of massive flooding reported over the weekend. Police announcing that all entrances to the northern city of Nahariya, for one, have been blocked off to incoming traffic. And this as the local Gaton River once again overflowed, condemning several parts of the city, both near the center and the beach, to submersion under the rainfall. Witnesses likewise comparing the scene to Venice. and the rain is expected to continue until Tuesday, Wednesday. Of course, with the bad also comes some good, because as the rainfall damaged coastal cities across the country, the Kinneret, or Sea of Galilee, Israel's largest freshwater resource, received a much-needed boost, rising now by a whopping 3.5 centimeters overnight Monday to just 1.1 meters below the upper red line threshold, or 208.8 meters below sea level. And in similar news, going from rain to snow, Israel's Hermon Nature and Ski Resort in the north had its first snowfall of the season, but no guests to fill the slopes due to the nationwide lockdowns. Miki Inbar, spokesperson for the Hermon Resort, with us to discuss. Miki, thank you so much for being with us. Now, how long has the Hermon Resort been closed for?
We've been closed since the second lockdown, actually. And up until now, we don't have any official permission to open the ski resort.
So how has your business been affected?
We've been losing like tens of millions of shekels, and we are like a very big site of tourists in the north of the country, and all over the north. If the Hermon side is not open during the winter, so all other attractions and restaurants and hotels are not getting their own money. So we are affected very badly from this decision, and we are trying to open the resort. We made a special page, and we headed to the government with, according to the government regulations, in opening the ski resort in Corona time. Like we made advanced reservations and purchase. You can come without reservation. Sure. We have a lot of people that are coming daily to the Hermon usually, and now we are limiting the amount of people that can get inside. Up until now, we didn't get any answer.
All right, well, so this petition to the government pending, and put aside, have you received any government assistance to stay alive?
No, nothing. We didn't get any assistance.
And you've asked for special licensing to open the resort. When do you expect any sort of response, or are you being totally, shown the wall?
Unfortunately, we don't know yet because no one talks to us. We are trying to get to a lot of government offices, and we didn't receive any answers up until now. So we don't know if we would be able to open the ski resort this season.
All right, well, I certainly hope that you guys get something from the government, either permission to open at limited capacity or some sort of assistance. I know a lot of people are similarly hurting. Until then, Miki Inbar, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight should be rainy and cold with lows averaging 48 degrees Fahrenheit or 9 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow you can expect more storms and rainfall and highs dropping to about 60 Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius. And now before we go, of course, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel.
החיסונים בדרך, אני עובד על זה סביב השעון. אבל עד שהם יגיעו, וגם אחרי שהם יגיעו, אנחנו חייבים להוריד את התחלואה שנמצאת בתחילתו של גל שלישי. אנחנו יכולים להוריד, הוכחנו את זה. הורדנו את התחלואה ואת התמותה ברמה כמעט הכי נמוכה במדינות אירופה. עשינו את זה כי לא היססנו לקבל את ההחלטות הנכונות בזמן. וגם עכשיו, אני לא אהסס להחזיר חלק מהמגבלות, וככל שנקדים להחזיר אותם, זמן המגבלות יהיה יותר קצר. ולכן יש כאן אור בקצה המגפה, אנחנו צריכים לעבוד יחד, גם להביא את החיסונים, גם להטיל את המגבלות כדי להוריד את התחלואה, ואנחנו יוצאים לזה.
I'm really impressed by that. Good comparisons. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.24 shekels to the American dollar and 2.53 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And then don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and let us know what you think. Subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.